So that gives you a great intro to our afternoon speakers. So we're going to go ahead and start with Dr. Greg Brooks. He's a professor at Eckerd College, and he's going to be talking about the sedimentary impact of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon event.
Okay, thank you, Monica. That was the perfect segue for what I'm going to be talking about here. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit from looking at oil itself. I'm going to focus on the impacts of the spill to the sedimentary system and how it's recorded in the sedimentary system, and then how we might be able to use this for management purposes. Many of us have seen this figure or a figure like this over the last 5 years, and basically this just depicts the many pathways that the oil has taken, how it gets there, where it ends up, and so on and so on. But what I want to focus on here is this pointer doesn't work, but you can see the oil slick there. There's a significant amount of oil that resided on the surface in an oil slick, as well as in deep water plumes, and I think that was the focus of some of the discussions this morning. And in many cases, we don't really know what the impacts of those that oil was to the sedimentary system. This is a photograph from space of the surface oil slick. You can see that it covered much of the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. In the inset there in the lower left, that's a computer, I guess, enhancement of that slick, and you can see that it actually covered a lot of the DeSoto Canyon region, which was our study area. So specific questions that I want to address here, did the event impact bottom sediments and or sediment distribution patterns and processes? And if so, how and to what extent is it manifested in the sedimentary record? In other words, what is the sedimentary signature of this event? Will it be preserved in the sedimentary record? And if so, for how long? And how are the sediments recording the recovery, if indeed the system is recovering, of the benthic system? And what I'm trying to get at here is that sediments are very sensitive environmental indicators. So even if the oil in this case is gone, the sedimentary signature of the event may still be there, and so this might be able to be used for management purposes. This is our study area. You can see DeSoto Canyon in the northeastern Gulf. The red and yellow and green dots are our core sites. Our database consists of cores collected on 12 coring cruises between 2010 and 2015. Over 100 cores were collected at more than 60 sites, ranging from about 100 meters to a little over 1,500 meters water depth. And some of these sites were occupied several times, up to 5 times in a time series over these 5 years. And these are the ones that I'm going to focus on today. You can see the yellow dots; those are the time series sites. That's what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation. And I want to point out that 2 of these sites are on the western flank of DeSoto Canyon, and 2 are on the eastern flank of DeSoto Canyon. This DeSoto Canyon represents a divide in sediment type. To the west of the canyon, the sediments are dominantly siliciclastic, which basically means that the sediments came out of the Mississippi River from the continental materials eroded on the land. To the east of the canyon, the sediments are dominantly calcium carbonate that consists of the remains of marine plants and animals. So 2 complete sedimentary regimes, and this is important because if there's been any change in the sedimentary system, we will be able to detect it because the ratio of sediments will change. In the lower right inset is the multi-core that you just saw. I won't go into any detail because you just saw how the thing operates, but basically the beauty of this thing is that it is designed so that it will collect the surface of the surface sediments with little or no disruption. So that's critical to us because anything that we would have seen from the spill would be in those surface. Even though the cores are not very long, I'm a geologist, so we would like to go far back in time, but these cores are only about 80 centimeters in length, but that's okay because it still recorded several hundred years of pre-event conditions, so we know what those pre-event conditions are to try to detect anything on the surface. Okay, so these are just some examples of some of the cores that we pulled up immediately after or shortly after the spill occurred. One obvious thing is this discolored surface layer, this brown surface layer. Immediately everybody thought, oh, that's oil. It's dark brown, looks like oil, must be oil. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but one thing I want to point out that's critical is that this discolored band contains one or even generally more than one dark band. And my pointer doesn't work, but you can see in P08 there's a dark brown or black band at the base of that discolored layer and another one in the middle of the layer. Same thing with DWH01. Most of the cores had this double band, and that's important for us. I'll talk about this a little bit later. Okay, so since we didn't know what that surface layer was, at the time we didn't know if it was oil or just the impacted layer or whatever, we sampled the surface layer at a very, very high resolution, 2 millimeter resolution, and we sampled by extruding the core from the bottom up to the surface. Below that layer, we sampled at 5 millimeters, also fairly high resolution, but we wanted to get the conditions, the pre-event conditions, so that we could detect any change. We analyzed these sediments by a number of different parameters: sediment texture, mineralogy, and elemental composition. Texture is basically the grain size, grain shape, grain attributes. Organic geochemistry, Isabel Romero, David Hollander will talk about these. Microbial community structure, Joel Koska's group at Georgia Tech took the lead on this. Benthic foraminifera abundance, Patrick Schwing at USF, who was in that video. Natural abundance radiocarbon, Jeff Chanton, who was heard earlier today, and geochronology, or age dating, and that's what our group did. So what I'm going to focus on here primarily is the geochronology and the sedimentology, the texture and composition. Sediment texture and composition can give us information regarding spatial and temporal change, variability through time, and our geochronology or age dating. We use short-lived radioisotopes to determine sedimentation and accumulation rates. Sedimentation rates and accumulation rates are two different things. Accumulation is how fast the sediment is accumulating. Sedimentation basically is the rate of sediment input into the system, but not all of it accumulates all the time. And also bioturbation rates, the organisms mixing this stuff around. I'll talk about the short-lived radioisotopes we use in a couple seconds. It's primarily thorium-234 and lead-210. The age control can help us to identify the sedimentological signature of an event, so because we can tie the actual known event in with what we see in the sedimentary record to determine what that signature is. All right, a little bit more on the geochronology. Once again, we use lead-210. Lead-210 has a half-life of about a little over 22 years. We can generally detect back 5 half-lives or so because there's just not that much material left after that. And so this gives us a detection window of about 100 or 110 years or so at decadal to annual scale resolution. Thorium-234 has a half-life of 24 days, very, very short half-life. So we're looking at a 4 to 5 month detection window. Now, thorium-234 is generally used as a tool to identify bioturbation or mixing of the surface sediments. And it's generally not used as a geochronological tool or an age dating tool because sediments generally do not accumulate rapidly enough to be detected in a 4 to 5 month window. But it can be used as a geochronological tool where we have the intact stratigraphy, no mixing, no bioturbation, no mixing, accumulation rates that are rapid enough such that we have more than just 1 or 2 data points in the surface, and we have very fine sampling resolution, which we have in this case, 2 millimeters. So in this case, it would be good for depositional events. I want to point out the photograph here. This photograph was taken on board ship immediately after the core was collected, and you can see that the surface is pretty much intact. There's been very, very little change in that surface. Okay, I'm going to show 2 core logs, core descriptions or core logs. And what I want to point out here, there's a variety of different data types, but what I want to point out here is that the surface layer, the surface 1 to 2 centimeters is distinctly different than underlying sediments. And the underlying sediments are fairly stable in almost all analysis types. So, for example, texture, which is shown over there, you can see near the surface, the texture tends to veer off in a certain direction. So there's significant change in texture, generally a fining upward through that surface layer. The hydrocarbon esignature that Isabel may or may not talk about in a few minutes, it shows petrogenic and pyrogenic hydrocarbons. This is the UCM concentration over to the right. In the surface layer, you see a big spike in that surface layer. And what this shows is not only that the surface layer is distinctly different, but it has characteristics of the sea surface. Shown here with the UCM, also the Del C14, that the natural abundance radiocarbon that Jeff Chanton worked on, significantly different in the surface. Phytoplankton, so Joel Koska's work shows up there, distinctly different in the surface, in the superficial sediment surface, and is characteristic of the sea surface. Oddly enough, there's very little change in composition and very little change in elemental composition, the mineralogic composition and elemental composition. The exception to that is manganese, which is found in the surface, and I'll talk about that a little later. This is another core, and it pretty much shows the same thing. The surface layer is distinctly different, and it has characteristics of the sea surface. I won't go through everything, but I do want to point out benthic foraminifera abundance that Patrick Schwing worked on shows no benthic forams in that surface layer. It's not that they were dead, they just weren't there. There's none in the surface layer. So once again, we have this surface layer that's distinctly different. It was not mixed downward, so the stratigraphy is intact, and it has characteristics of the sea surface. Getting to the geochronology, these are curves of the 4 sites that we look at, time series sites. And if I want to point out the pinkish color is the thorium-234. And what it shows is the thorium-234 exists throughout that entire surface layer, and then it pretty much goes to 0. This is excess thorium-234, which is what we use for dating. What this suggests in the absence of mixing is that this layer was deposited within 4 or 5 months, and that's an extremely high rate of deposition. However, we cannot rule out bioturbation. So I can't emphasize that enough. Bioturbation can be a problem here. So what we did when we looked at thorium-234, we analyzed it in terms of MAR, mass accumulation rates. We determined mass accumulation rates in grams per centimeter squared per year, but that can be influenced by bioturbation. But we also analyzed or calculated thorium-234 inventory, which is just the amount of thorium-234 in the record, and that is independent of bioturbation. So this would support possibly the mass accumulation rate data. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to go through slices of this time series. At the top, that's the thorium-234 mass accumulation rates. The bottom, thorium-234 inventories. And here we have November, December 2010 up to February 2011, so very shortly after the event occurred. And these are the 4 time series sites, and once again, mass accumulation rates at the top, thorium-234 inventories. These are high values. They're very high values for this type of system. Going to the next 2 years, notice how they both decrease significantly, both for mass accumulation rates and thorium-234 inventories. So this would suggest to us that we had a rapid depositional event that occurred within a few months after the spill occurred, or essentially after the summer, and it relaxed very quickly. So we may be able to say that in this case, the actual recovery of the sedimentological system may have occurred very quickly, if indeed that is actual recovery. We really can't say that that's actual recovery, but it's consistent with recovery. And in the next 2013 to 2014, notice that both the mass accumulation rates and the inventories stay fairly low, with a couple of exceptions that I'll talk about. They stay fairly low, once again suggesting that there's relaxation in deposition occurred and stayed relatively stable for this 2013 and 2014. An exception is DSH-08, the yellow one. The yellow one seems to have gone back up in mass accumulation rates, in 2013, 2014. However, this is not supported by the inventory in the bottom one. And once again, as I mentioned, if you mix these downward, then it will appear as though sediments are accumulating faster than what they really are. So this is not an increase in mass accumulation rates. It's an apparent increase in mass accumulation rates, but it's not supported by the thorium inventories. This likely is a response to the reestablishment of bioturbation, the organisms getting back in there and mixing things up. But that's just at that one site so far. We haven't seen it at another site. This is actually supported by the benthic foraminifera abundance as well, because Patrick Schwing noticed an increase in benthic foraminifera just at this one site over those 2 years as well. All right, so what happened? Well, what we believe happened is there was a documented marine snow event during the summer of 2010. David Hollander will talk about this. It's called MOSPA. It's a MOSPA event. And I think David will go into more detail on this. This marine snow, which likely occurred due to the slick, the oil slick, it's very sticky. And once enough particles stick to it, it will lose buoyancy. It settles rapidly to the sea floor, and it strips the water column pretty much of any particulate in the water column. And once it reaches the sea floor, it blankets the sea floor, possibly causing anoxia. Other marine snow events have documented this. We have not. We just did not detect it. But also, it can shut down bioturbation, which we notice, and therefore preserve the pulse layer, at least preserve it to what we have today. And this is supported by the sea surface characteristics in the sediment, in that surface sediment layer. It also supports the fact that there's no change in composition, in mineralogical composition. What it did was just strip the water column of all the natural particles in the water column that would have settled out at that spot anyway. It just settled out much more rapidly. It would also explain the benthic forium abundance in the surface layer, because it came from the sea surface. There are no benthic foriums there. With respect to the brown layer that I mentioned earlier, this is not oil. This is actually a geochemical response to the system. And it's actually manganese oxide. And what happens is, at the base of that brown layer, below that, the environment is reducing. And in reducing environments, manganese is liberated. It migrates upward until it hits that redox layer. And when it hits that, it precipitates out as manganese oxide. Now, generally, there's a dark brown or black layer at the base of that, and then it kind of lightens it at the top. And that's known, that's very common. But where you have double dark bands, what that represents is an upward jump of that redox boundary in response to a rapid depositional event. So when that blanket fell down, when that sediment pulse fell down on top of it, the redox boundary jumped upward such that the lower boundary was no longer active. It was a relic boundary. Now the active boundary is the one in the middle. All right, so quickly, in conclusion, sediment pulse was detected in late 2010, which was likely direct or indirect impact from the DWH event. We required high-resolution sampling and analysis, and especially the geochronology to detect this. The sedimentological signature was an increase in thorium-234 mass accumulation rates and inventories. This layer had sea surface characteristics and the double manganese oxide peak. Sedimentary impacts, which actually is related to the sedimentary signature. Subtle decrease in texture and grain size, bioturbation was shut down. As far as the recovery, we can't say definitely it was a recovery, but it's definitely a relaxation, and it's consistent with a recovery. It appears as though the sedimentological system on thorium-234 mass accumulation rates and inventories relaxed in less than 1 year. However, bioturbation has taken at least 5 years to recover. The preservation potential in the long term, we don't know. It's been preserved so far, but maybe it's been preserved because bioturbation has not mixed it. So that's still a work in progress. Implications for management. Once again, I said sediments are sensitive environmental indicators. They can record even minor changes in the environment. And so they may provide a response of a system to an impact, in this case an oil impact, even in the absence of oil itself. So even if the oil might be gone, the actual impact may be preserved in the sedimentary record. However, we need to identify what that sedimentological signature is in order to do that. And I put Ixtoc here. People mentioned Ixtoc a little bit earlier. Ixtoc was a spill that occurred in the late 70s off the northern coast of Mexico, Gulf Coast of Mexico. And that's 40 years old or so. So we are actually going back now to look at the sedimentological signature of the Ixtoc spill to see if it matches any of what we see in the northern Gulf. And in many cases, we can see that double manganese oxide band. David Hollander will talk about that in a little bit more detail in a couple of minutes. So this would require high-resolution sampling and analytical tools, as well as a rapid response. Thorium-234 is very short-lived. It's gone in a few months. So in order to detect this, you need to get right out there. And also, it might require non-traditional methodologies. A lot of these events, they change the system by so much that we might be able to use non-traditional methodologies to detect certain things or detect change. For example, thorium-234 geochronology we discussed here. All right, with that, I will stop. And questions, or are we going to wait for the end? Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So our next presenter is David Hollander, who's an associate professor at the University of South Florida, and you guys have seen him on both of our clips. I'm sure he'll offer autographs later if you need to. Yeah.